Welcome back to the class, everyone. Grand Arena Omicrons can make or break a lot of battles, and we are now up to a grand total of 54 of them. So it's time, once again, that we take a look and point out which ones are amazing, which ones are good, and which ones Calvin applied to Luminar. Still not salty about that at all, but it's no one's fault but my own. Anyways, so how we're going to do this is the same way that we did it last time, and that is we are going to talk about the characters that have 3 GAC Omicrons on them, and we're going to work through which ones really need their 2nd and 3rd Omicrons, and then after we work through the more powerful characters here, we will talk about all the characters that have single Omicrons and where they stack up against each other. I find that it's easiest just to do it this way, because when it comes to the triple Omicron characters, almost everyone out there that's even remotely interested or invested in GAC is going to put on 1 Omicron on every single one of these characters. For most of the ones that do not have leadership, it's going to be on their unique abilities, much like Darth Malgus or Bane Solo or even Darth Bane. But when we work down to the ones that actually do have leaderships like Malgus, Third Sister, and Afra, the leadership is typically the one that we put on them. So going back to the very top here, the character that is most important to have all 3 Omicrons across the board is going to be Darth Malgus, and he's really the only one who I would say can even use all 3 on a consistent basis. We're not going to go talk a lot about the unique because almost everybody agrees this is very good. A lot of Malgus' personality is trapped behind this ability. It's what allows him to attack out of turn, which is very important because it gets repost so we can hit underneath people's protection and just outright kill them, because he'll be assisting, 3 or 4 times in between his own turns due to his allies calling him in. The 2nd Omicron is also very important. This is where the savior type mechanic comes from, helping him save either crew as the tank or maybe even one of the other good damage doers like Fulcrum or even Seer on the team. There are a few additional things that it does with this that add more durability to the UFU team that he's going to be under, and ultimately just make him a lot harder to kill and even die well. But I don't even have this Omicron, but I do understand why it's good, and I think it's going to shine more on offense than it is on defense. But the reality is it's increasing his offense and critical damage, which are 2 great things for an attacker to have increased consistently throughout the battle, and it's stacking. It has no limit, and it's not like it goes away after 2 or 3 turns. It just keeps going and going and going. And the reason why I like it on Terran so much is because the Seer team that he's typically put under just has so much durability and control and immunity to a lot of the stuns or dazes that are out there. The battle typically goes on for a while, and eventually Malgus will be able to pull ahead if he's been stacking up these 2 stacks the entire time. So overall, Malgus, great option to apply all 3 of the Omicrons to, assuming you have them available. Now I will say, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, this is not a ranking of characters, and this will apply both to the single Omicron and the triple Omicron characters. We're not trying to say that Terran is an overall better character than Bane. That's probably not the case, at least with the Bane we have right now, assuming... I guess let's not get into the nerf conversation. But all that to say is the reason that Terran is at the top isn't because he's the better character, but because his 3 Omicrons are more crucial to what his potential allows you to do. Next up, speaking of Bane, he has 2 very good Omicrons that I do think are going to change up a lot of counters out there. Rule of 2 is obviously the best. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. The extra health is very important for a lot of the battles out there because he essentially is the tank. The other Omicron that is very good is going to be Essence of Dominance. I love this a lot because decreasing defense by 20%, that's going to be enough to work down a lot of the characters that C just can't zap out right out the gate. And assuming he doesn't ultimately get nerfed, the 2 cooldown increase is very helpful because that keeps characters that even if they were modded tankier, like Thrawn or Hondo, from eventually locking him up and just keeping him out entirely. The last Malevolent Whirlwind, we don't really know if this is super important right now. The only situation that I've even heard this is remotely important is if you're wanting C and Bane to beat JMK, and there's, again, I don't have hard confirmation of this, but the extra ultimate charge gets C to his ult in enough time that he can zap out Cat. That may or may not be necessary. I've heard both reports on both sides of saying, yeah, they were able to get it before it happened, or they weren't. And I think there's a lot of other factors in there, like how fast was Cat, how fast was Bane, but overall, the 2 should just be fine on him. With Bane Solo, it's going to be pretty similar. His healing immunity for 4 turns. This isn't just going to be useful against C, and well, I guess it's not as useful against C now because Bane makes everyone immune to the healing immunity, which is super fun for them. But at the same time, this is just a pain in the butt to deal with. If you're ever doing a Rey mirror, which is pretty common, especially when Rey has a Datacron that blocks out Starkiller, 4-turn healing immunity is not fun to deal with. It also isn't great for JML or even JMK that we recently learned, just because 4 turns, it takes forever to get around, and then it can't be dispelled, evaded, or anything like that. And then obviously Force Dyad, this is the good one that has the whole reviving mechanic that is very annoying to deal with almost any squad that you have if they can't stop revives. Next up is going to be the 1 is typically fine squad. Starkiller, obviously unique. Darth Malgus, obviously leadership are very good. I don't really hate these other ones. I obviously applied this one, and I really don't regret it. There are still some Rey squads out there that have too many buffs, and you always need more dispels on all the characters, because when you get the crit immunity off, that's how you're able to crit Rey, even if it is just with an AoE to remove the inspired, so she's not gaining a ridiculous amount of offense. This also isn't terrible if you're trying to kill the solo JTR at the end, but not overall crucial to what the team usually does. Darth Malgus is going to be very similar. Leadership, obviously good. We're not going to talk about it. This one's all right. It just kind of sucks because it's essentially a 5v5 Omicron, because the way that doubt spreads, it already spreads to the whole team if you're in 3v3. And then, you know, this is nice to have for turn meter and other things, and things can't be resisted, but ultimately it doesn't change a lot of the counters out there that exist. So you can apply them, and you might see some niche uses here and there, but overall it's not going to matter that much. Baton, leadership, it seems to be the best. This one we really just don't know almost anything about, and that's not to say Baton's a bad character or people don't ever locked her, they haven't used her, but almost for the entirety of her existence, we've had the Datacron, and the Datacron is busted, so she might totally need one Omicron to be able to beat Lord Vader. She might not. We have no idea, because the Datacron is completely taken over in that category, and it's not even close regardless of what you have. And in the last category is going to be Reva and Afra, and again, reminder, this is not a squad ranking video where we're saying that Third Sister is worse than all the characters that came before, but it's just that her leadership in general is not the entirety of her kit. It is going to allow them to have Death Mark, which is very cool, but at the same time, Reva kills a lot of things even without the Death Mark. She has locked healing immunity. They deal a ton of damage, ton of control as far as the Inquisitorius go. Dr. Afra is going to be along the same lines. The leadership is overall good, but you don't necessarily need it to do everything she wants to do. It just makes it a little bit easier. Kind of closes some gaps as far as relics and mods go. And going back to Reva again, I guess this does help with JMK a little bit, but again, it doesn't completely shut her out. And Reva beats a lot of things also that aren't JMK and can do things on defense, especially given the certain Datacron. So that is going to be the triple Omicron portion right there, and how we have that ranked out right now. Next up, getting onto our single Omicrons. Once I can find the tab, this is how it's going to work. We're going to work down through all the different tiers. We have broken these out more than usual just because we have more of them, and it felt really kind of dumb to only put them in 3 different categories, especially when we're growing to a list of 30. It didn't seem that helpful. I wanted to break it down and really show which ones are legitimately better than others. So at the very tippy top of the list that I think just is indisputable is going to be Darth, Trey, and Savage. And the thing that I love about them as far as GAC Omicrons go is they're amazing across the board. This is still a very good team to put on the board all the way up in Kyber 1, and it's not really even shut off to all the people that are in the lower areas. Savage just ultimately makes an amazing tank, and Darth Treya makes the team almost unkillable. It's actually a unique Omicron with everything that it does, and one of the beauties of it is the fact that it grants it bonus protection, I believe, on the Omicron here whenever they get a debuff, which is huge, because when a really strong other team out there has locked healing immunity, aka Reva, you're able to bypass it because you're not technically recovering health protection, you're gaining bonus protection on top of it. So overall, great kits, kills a ton of stuff, not terrible on defense, especially with how most people are breaking up their rosters right now. Almost always calls in a Galactic Legend. Gidme is a possible counter, but a lot of times both Padme and Gideon have other higher tasks that they're doing right now, given the way that team comps are currently worked out. So they're just the best. You don't have to use them together. You can use them separately. There is value there as well. Just depends on how many teams you need and whether you need super teams or more normal teams, I guess. Next up is going to be what we'll call the good transformative category. None of these are really quite doing what Treya as well as Savage are doing, but they're still wildly transforming the teams that they're currently in and are beating things they otherwise would never be able to touch, and oftentimes really good teams. Wampa still has some high targets out there, like our good friend Mon Mothma. Iden without Scout Trooper, even in some cases with Scout Trooper, and even some of the General Grievous teams. We don't have full confirmation of stops Wampa, but for the most part, there's still plenty of other teams that Wombo will beat. And the fact that he beats them all on his own, or all on her own, whichever side of that debate you sit on, that's pretty incredible. That's really nice from a roster building perspective to have one character that is just an entire team and not having to relic 4 other characters just to get them up to the competitive area. Qui-Gon has fallen a little bit for me, and the only reason why is because Kelleron Beck, for people who don't really want to spend a lot of GAC Omicrons, his leadership actually isn't that bad in GAC, despite the fact that it's more made for TW with the Omicron there, but it gives an alternative for you to use your characters like Jedi Anakin or Cam, who may not have had that big of a home elsewhere. They can fit in with him, but overall, Qui-Gon Jinn just still doing stupid things, particularly on offense more than defense. Beck has revived him a little bit more on defense with the anti-Bad Batch mechanics that he has allowed. Doesn't completely shut out the counter, but does make it a lot harder, especially for people who aren't really ready for what it's going to do. Next up is going to be Iden Versio. Love Iden. She's taken a little bit of a hit recently because Dark Trooper Moff Gideon has wanted to steal a lot of the members of her team, or at least the better members of her team. But overall, she's still killing lots of stuff out there, both offensive and defensively, especially if you can give her Scout Trooper for the defensive perspective against what we've already talked about as far as Wampa goes. Tuscan Raider. I really like Tuscan Raider. The only caveat to Tuscan Raider is he's trapped to 3v3, so I wanted to put this lower, but in reality, it is wildly transforming what the Tuscans are able to do in 3v3, whether you're putting him with kind of the bad or lead, or if you're putting him with the Chieftain lead. There are very few counters that are non-GL that can actually still beat that out. General Skywalker being one of the primary ones, who is kind of an expensive counter, especially if you're at a lower part of the game, and Tuscan Raider himself is very accessible to that part. Next up is going to be what we'll call the Fine Transformative Group. I do like Sears. It does change a lot of the matchups just because it gives her team not certain immunities, but it does give immunities. It just allow them to, but yeah, they're just flat out immune to ability blocking days. This really hampers Bad Batch. I've actually won entire matches because my opponents didn't have this Omicron, and I was able to use a cheaper counter like Bad Batch against Seer. The other reason why she's kind of on this lower section of the Transformative is because ultimately her team, to do all the really strong things that it wants to do, is going to need Malakos, and that's more reflective of his Omicrons than it is of hers. Dashes, also known as the Vanderkron, allows all of his allies to have prepared the entire match. Even if they lose it, they immediately gain it back. So Vander specifically, who loses prepared when an ally dies and he revives them, will essentially turns into an old Daka, where he's reviving them every single time they go out, assuming there isn't any anti-revive stuff out there. Pretty good, has fallen a little bit off, but does stop a few counters. Hondo, speaking of stopping counters for the Dash team, he gets 100%, or basically 100% turn meter right out the gate with his GAC Omicron, assuming you have all the 4 Scoundrel allies, which is going to make several counters like Troopers, like Bounty Hunters, more problematic, because depending on who he uses his captive on can just change the entirety of the match. If it's on a really crucial character that was needed for the setup to be able to get your Annihilate or Dark punching really hard, then you're just going to be in trouble overall. Zam has kind of moved a little bit more back into relevancy recently because the Bounty Hunter team is starting to close out against Lord Vader, while some people still do use it. With the introduction of both Bo-Katan as well as better Lord Vader teams, it's not happening as much, meaning that Zam gets a really good place back in the Bounty Hunter team, where she's giving them on average about 70 to 80 speed, which allows them to again beat things that they would not normally be able to beat, being trapped at those speeds around 330 rather than say 400 where she's allowing them to be. Next up is going to be the helpful tiers. Now, these the helpful different from the transformative. The transformative really does change a lot of relevant counters. We tried to point those out as best we could, and at least in the time we're given here. The helpful tier, most of these don't really change counters that much. They might just change win rates by about 5 or 10%. For some people, that amount of value is going to be good, especially because, you know, if you have all your GAC Omicrons on these characters, maybe you don't have the right character unlocked that also needs a better Omicron. These are probably worth considering, especially if you are GAC focused. The Nightsisters being the first ones up, I do like these a lot. Ultimately, I don't think Nightsisters necessarily unlock a huge variety of counters, nor do they shut off a lot as far as their defensive viability goes, but these are just really nice to have in general. I like the healing immunity on Asajj's Rampage. This allows you to have a really fun mechanic between healing immunity and Plague, where the enemy can't cleanse or heal, and they eventually just die if they can't wait it out. And then on top of that, our good friend Marin here is doing even more impressive things by the fact that she is constantly spreading Plague without really having to use her basic ability. All she has to do is pass through the turn. The turn meter thing is a little bit nuanced. We won't get too into it, but overall, these are good. help the Nightsisters do what they already do just a little bit better, closing the gaps when there are differences in things like relics, datacrons, mods, etc. Next up is going to be Captain Rex. I love Captain Rex. This is not meant to not Captain Rex at all, but just the fact that he still beats most of the same teams he would beat without the 25 speed, 60% health, and the ability to immediately shake off things like daze. Overall, again, still a great team. The Omicron is good. It's just going to help close gaps and help him do what he was already doing to a better extent, like counter Reva. Again, Reva doesn't really have anything that specifically happens in here that would require the Omicron, but, 60% health really never hurt any team out there, except I guess max health damage. Anyways, next up is going to be Zori. Again, Zori's still going to do most everything that she would do otherwise, but making sure that all of your enemies are consistently exposed so that you get all those juicy benefits from what Finn's leadership is wanting to do is an extra plus. Stap is probably here. We don't, again, very similar to Bo-Katan. This one is very new. We don't have a whole lot of data or information of whether this is really changing a counter. And what's really hard about this too is most of the people that already have this character all the way up at 7 stars or Relic 5 or whatever it is, they have really strong opponents with really large resources. So it's hard to tell if this is actually calling or changing what would be a relevant counter. But for everything it's doing, it seems like it would be important. It does have specific synergy referring to Bad Batch with the true damage, and then also 20% max health stacking. For characters like General Grievous, who all of their damage is based off of max health, seems pretty important for what that team wants to do. Next up is going to be the Tier 2. By the way, Tier 2 is less than Tier 1. That has not always been the case in these type of videos. It is the case in this video. First up, First Order TIE Pilot. I like this a lot. My issue with First Order TIE Pilot, why he wouldn't be higher on the list, is purely because the opportunity to use this is pretty low. If you only have 1 or 2, maybe 3 Galactic Legends, then you're probably wanting to make 2 really good First Order teams, and you're going to see a lot higher value for this. But as you advance in your roster, the secondary First Order team that you're making outside of your SLKR is just going to get worse and worse and counter less and less things. I still use it fairly frequently in 3v3, but as we've kind of mentioned here before, 3v3 or 5v5 only Omicrons tend to get a little bit of a lesser rating, I guess, unless your name is Tuscan Raider. Next up is going to be Rose. I actually don't hate Rose's Omicron. It does very much in line with what it's supposed to do in the Finn leadership along with Zori in there. It gives more turn meter and more offense to your whole squad. 2 things that really don't hurt. Do they need it? Probably not. Is it helpful in closing some possible gaps? Also, yes. Next up is going to be Saw Gerrera. I actually like Saw's Omicron quite a bit. It does several fun things. My issue with him, and the reason why he's this low, is it's just not that accessible of a character. While a lot of people have him at Gear 12 due to going after Cal Kestis, a lot of people haven't built up the characters that he wants to be with, like Chirrut and Baze. I guess I myself did it for Datacrons, but most people's rosters do not revolve around what is the new Datacron this week. They have larger farming plans that involve getting better characters like Cal Kestis, like building out their Inquisitors, other legendaries, Galactic Legends, Leviathan, etc. Next up is going to be Drogon, and I like Drogons. It just doesn't seem to actually be changing most of what happens. 50% health is good. Dispel is good. That's good. It's all good. Leia's still doing everything that she would do. Pretty much with or without it, you're, again, helping close some small gaps here and there, but overall, it's not closing out like counter A, B, C, D, or whatever. Admiral Abar, pretty much the exact same thing. Is it nice to have what it brings to the table? Certainly. 40% max protection, especially if you're dealing with a lot of punch-up scenarios where you're trying to get Admiral Abar to work against Reva. That's great. But at the same time, most people aren't going to be in that situation where they're going to need these. And even with these, it's not a guaranteed win. It is just a nice bonus to have on top of everything else. So again, if you can spare them, they're not that bad, but maybe you should just be better off having 3 stockholded. That way, when a character does come out, that would be higher in the tier, maybe even one of the triple Omicron characters, you could use it there. And next are going to be the niche ones, and I really don't like these. I would, unless you're just exploding with Omicrons, I would avoid these. Most of these are going to be temporarily good at best, and even then, it's just not much. Speaking of which, first up is going to be Chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemum's overall, it's not that bad. It's just very similar to Drogon's. It doesn't change almost anything in what he's doing. It does slightly mess with the Afra matchup. There's an Afra counter out there that utilizes both B2 as well as Darth Vader, and it is rather important that you make sure and get buff immunity on Chrysanthemum to be able to get around and get to Boosh and the rest of the enemies. That being said, that's really the only time this ever comes into any time at all. And the amount of people that are using that counter, and again, it's not a guaranteed hold. The fact that all enemies have 30% less potency, that's not a guarantee that you just outright stop it, although it does curb it just a little bit. Chief Chirpa is more so an issue of most people out there just shouldn't be building their entire Ewoks to higher relics. It can be nice for a time, especially with Princess Nisa, who is running around right now. And I realize anyone who went for Leia early on, they had to bring up most of their Ewoks already to Relic 3, or I think or Relic 7 in the case of Princess Nisa. So maybe it could be something fun, but it's not going to last overall that long when it comes to overall GAC viability, just because the team, even at its best, doesn't have a lot of high options that it can beat without putting a kind of unreasonable amount of resources into it, like R7 on every single character. Next up is going to be Talon. Love Talon. Reminder again, this is not a ranking of characters, this is a ranking of Omicrons. Talon is a very good character. She is the ideal fifth on both the Malgus as well as the Traya team. The reality is, this just doesn't do much at all. At least it doesn't do a whole lot for the team she's in. What is it here? Whenever, if a target enemy is afflicted with Isolate or Pain, they gain additional effects whenever Darth Talon defeats an enemy. So whenever she defeats an enemy, all their Sith allies gain 5% max protection offense for her Stacks of Loyal Hand. I mean, you just don't need that. If you have her in a Traya team, you're getting Annihilates and you're getting a stupid amount of bonus protection. Like, even if those numbers were higher, it wouldn't be super relevant. Darth Malgus is kind of the same. You have a ton of max health damage out there with Malgus and Malak just kind of ripping through everyone. This isn't really what's needed to get things off the ground. And I realize there is some other stuff going on in here, but it's just not enough. The team's already doing fantastically well without the Omicron, so we don't really need to bother considering it. Again, it can make the team slightly better in some situations where that slight boost of offense actually is making a difference, but for the most part, it's pretty niche. Next up is going to be Admiral Abar as well as Princess Leia. They kind of go in the same category overall. Just not a whole lot going on here. They have some timeout opportunities, but most teams that have any type of stacking damage can eventually get around this, especially if they counter or something like that. I guess Leia stealth, but the rest of them don't really have the opportunity. You can, if you're on a strapped roster, put some better characters with them, but at the same time, my biggest issue with putting things like CLS here is CLS is already doing a lot of really cool things without having to invest 2 Omicrons into 2 characters that just don't have all that much longevity. Next up is going to be Niche 2, aka our Luminar Cron that we already previously talked about. This, we're trying to spend too much time here, had a ton of potential. There's a lot of wording here. The biggest issue is most of the good characters Luminar can be put with are going to be using a protection up type ability like Grandmaster Yoda, JMK, Padme, Jedi Anakin. The list kind of goes on and on. So the amount of characters she can actually be put with this where this is actually doing a decent amount is going to be like JML, and even then, there's so many characters that can give JML a cleanse. It's not all that big of a deal, and the AI is even worse on it because the AI still recognizes this as a heal, not as a cleanse. So the team can be loaded with debuffs, and she won't even pull to this if you put it on defense. I've tried things with Starkiller. I've tried things with JML. There are some situations where people can get some worth out of it, but ultimately it's not all that high on the list. So if you haven't and you're getting use out of it, great. I wouldn't recommend it for most people, though. Next up is going to be Director Krennic, and Director Krennic's Omicron issues the same issue that he has as a person, I guess. He wants to be with Death Trooper, and Death Trooper has 4 better teams that he doesn't want to play with Krennic. Even if you have Krennic at Relics because of Sith Eternal, Death Trooper doesn't want to play with him. This is okay. It's not great. Even if it was better, I don't know if it would matter. Because Tuscan Chieftain actually runs into a very similar problem. Tuscan Chieftain's Omicron is actually amazing. The biggest issue with it is it all revolves around Boba Fett, Scion of Django, and almost everyone out there has more accessible Tuscan Raider in 3v3 rather than Boba Fett, Scion of Django, who is a conquest character. And overall, the Tuscan Raider Omicron stops more thing the Scion of Django does. So overall, it doesn't really matter how good this is. If it's worse than the Tuscan Raider Omicron that is more available, there's very few players out there who are going to genuinely benefit for that. And I guess there can be things that change with datacrons and stuff, but I don't like making, again, longevity decisions based off of datacrons that are temporary. Triple Zeros, I mean, it's not good. It makes one of his abilities last for 2 turns instead of 1, essentially. I mean, there's some other little things in here. Again, not changing any counters. there might be a really niche situation where the torture for lasting for 2 turns actually mattered more. But again, it's 3v3 too, so that's an immediate knock. And last and definitely going to be, at least, is going to be BT1. We've hated on this ability tons. We're going to keep hating on it because it's garbage. Whenever BT1 or 000 defeat an enemy, their cooldowns refresh and they gain 30% turn meter. You look at his kit. Whenever he defeats an enemy, he's already locked into only using this ability and a bonus turn. So any of the turn meter and cooldowns he's getting decreased by killing an enemy, completely wasted. Because he gets a bonus turn, and he has to use Haywire no matter what. No Omicron required. Stupid ability. I guess it applies to Trooper 02, so that would be the one reason why you would put it on. But ultimately, it just doesn't mesh with this kit. Also 3v3, so more -2 points or whatever. That is going to be our video. Tell me what you guys think. What characters might be blocking out or unlocking more counters that we might not be realizing. And as always, thank you for watching, and stay awesome.